He's the Stone Zone with Roger Stone.
People love him and respect him. Roger Stone.
Now, get in the zone. It's the Stone Zone. Here's Roger Stone.
Joining me now is a good friend of mine, Captain Seth Keshel, who is a battlefield-level analytical, brings a battlefield-level analytical discipline to one of the most contentious issues in the country, election integrity. He is a former U.S. military intelligence captain, a veteran of Afghanistan, but he's also, in my opinion, one of the most recognized and credible independent analysts investigating voter registration anomalies, election procedures, systematic vulnerabilities in U.S. elections. But the other thing he is excellent on is trends in being able to project where our politics is going. He has a new book, which I highly recommended to you, The American War on Election Corruption, which you should go out and get immediately. It has a foreword by former Speaker Newt Gingrich. Has a great cover. Seth, welcome to the Stone Zone.
Roger, it's great to be back on with you, and I will tell your audience that I am disappointed I did not make your best dressed list for 2025.
Well, you've heard of payola, haven't you? No, not really. I haven't looked at you in those terms, but I will reevaluate you for next year's awards. You are someone who I have deep respect for in that you're analysts of the trends in voting and the anomalies in voting. So a couple of things I wanted to ask you about that I'm very curious, and that is, how is it possible that Donald Trump wins Wisconsin while the Republican Senate candidate in 2024 is going down narrowly? How is it that Trump carries Arizona by the margin he does, but the Senate candidate, our mutual friend, Kari Lake, goes down to a dirt bag? How are those anomalies possible? Because that seems unlikely to me.
I think the 2024 election was similar to the 2020 election, but when Trump made the catchphrase "too big to rig," he meant that. And I think that in Pennsylvania, you probably would have had a different result had Trump not converted 100,000 or so voters that Harris probably expected to have camp. But down ballot, once Trump had been declared the victor and all eyes were off the election, that particular race you mentioned in Wisconsin flipped in the middle of the night. At the end of counting time on election night, I remember specifically seeing Trump ahead in Wisconsin by about 4 points, which is where my numbers had him. And, of course, over time, over a few hours, Trump's lead went down below 1 point, and with it, so did Eric Hufty's lead, and he lost, and they didn't count a single vote again.
I find both of those races to be enormously suspicious. I mean, generally speaking, the idea that Joe Biden got 81 million votes when he was essentially a diaper-wearing vegetable for a good part of that campaign. They kept him in the basement at his home in Delaware. They would sometimes drive him 20 miles over the Pennsylvania border for a small meet and greet so they could say he was doing a campaign event in the Keystone State. Everybody, I think, on our side of the aisle gets wrapped up in algorithms and the nuances of mail-in ballots, the integrity or lack thereof of the electronic voting machines. But in a larger sense, wouldn't the SAVE Act in one swoop clean up a large segment of that election fraud and irregularities that do take place?
Yes, I come to odds with people who are, obsessed with machine voting or they're obsessed with mail-in ballots. But the foundation of all the corruption in our elections is the voter registration system. And the most nefarious act in voter registration is to implement automatic voter registration. That wasn't a thing in the United States until 2015 when California and Oregon started pushing that through. In the 2020 election, Joe Biden won 18 out of 20 states that had automatic voter registration, and the edge was 243 electoral votes to 9.
Yeah,
so Biden had 90% of the electoral votes he needed just because of automatic registration. So that populates way more registrations than are possible, which are then outfitted with mail-in ballot requests, or in the case of universal mail-in voting, all these registrations receive a ballot, which are then harvested up over a very lengthy early voting period.
Well, let's also make it clear, at the same time, the voting lists are not being cleaned. So last time I was in Las Vegas, I gave a speech for the president at the end of the last presidential campaign, speaking of an event in Las Vegas, a guy came up to me and he showed me 5 ballots. And they were all addressed to different people, but all at the same address. One of them was addressed to him. And I said, what's this? He said, well, these are all the mail-in ballots I've received at my home. I said, well, if you were a dishonest person, you could cast every one of those for Donald Trump. She said, yeah, but I'm not even going to cast this one. I'm going to go in and vote in person because I don't trust them. And I said, well, that's the attitude. I said, who are these other people? He said, well, 2 of them, these are all people who lived in my apartment before me. 2 of them are dead. One of them has moved out of state, and the other one is still in the state but has moved to another location. So it just is, and that, of course, is a remnant of the Harry Reid machine, which, mandated that a ballot be mailed to every registered voter, whether you asked for one or not.
Well, Roger, the event that you came to in Washington, D.C. on the 19th of February, our Election Integrity Summit, the gentleman that spoke a couple hours before you, Dr. John Lott, I asked him specifically to come in to talk about his extensive research on mail-in ballot fraud. And it's a really sad thing. We don't use a lot of the information we can find openly available to our benefit. 34 out of 47 European countries ban mail-in voting outright. And some of the ones that do allow it only allow it for overseas citizens. So we're talking about a couple thousand ballots. Mexico, Japan, Russia, Israel, they all ban mail-in voting. So why is it that our blue states are going the other direction?
No, I think you raise an excellent point. So, for example, the fact that 300,000 ballots have essentially popped up at the Detroit Counting Center in Michigan at 3 o'clock in the morning, the fact that they hadn't been folded and therefore had never been mailed, that doesn't really matter, does it?
No, of course, as long as it advances the Democrat agenda of win. I mean, they've been doing this in American elections for a long time. In my book, I point out Democrat operatives in 1864 trying to steal New York State for George McClellan against Abraham Lincoln by using fake signatures on absentee ballots.
Yeah, I mean, when I went to vote myself in the last election, I was waiting in line, and because I always try to vote in person, and a man in front of me stepped up and produced his ID and his address, and the lady working, the temporary election worker behind the desk said, "Oh, I'm sorry, sir, you already voted this morning." He said, "No, I didn't." She says, "Oh no, you voted it," and she gave him a time. And he said, let's say his name was John Smith, and he says, "May I ask you a question? Is there also a Rhonda Smith registered to the same address?" And the woman says, "Oh yes, and she voted also." He said, "Well, that's my mother. She's been dead for 15 years. Welcome to Broward County, Florida, ladies and gentlemen, where dirty voter lists are the norm. This claim by Governor Ron DeSantis that we run the gold standard of elections is just not true based on the myriad of problems. Even when the boards of elections mail out a mail-in ballot, it has to be requested in the event that it is undeliverable. In the primaries 2 years ago, 4,000 were returned to the Lake County Board of Elections, and somebody cast those votes. So it's a very corrupt system here, and you're right. I think it all goes back to the voter lists. And
that's exactly why you don't see a lot of these states, almost all the states, including the red ones, cooperating with the DOJ and the orders to turn over voter rolls.
So I love he puts Boss Tweed on the cover of his great new book, The American War on Election Corruption, The Crusade to Restore Trust in Voting. Newt Gingrich wrote the foreword. It's a terrific work. I'm only about a third into it, but it is also a great cover. You say you have some concerns about the over the Texas Senate primary.
I am concerned about it, and I think it presents a combination of issues. It presents a very serious political problem, number one, because it was a nasty primary. I'm not one of these people that panics over Texas every 2 years, but I think you've got one race that sticks out to people that is causing some concern, and that would be Ted Cruz in 2018 in his re-election bid against Robert Francis Beto O'Rourke, who came within 3 points of flipping that seat. Now, Ted was a very lazy campaigner, in my opinion. I think that he listened to some pretty bad advice, and he was going for a blowout when he was barely winning. But Ken Paxton got outspent big time. Cornyn put $60 million in the race to harm him, and I'm not so sure where Wesley Hunt's candidacy came from. I think I have an idea. But Cornyn really damaged Paxton, who underperformed by at least 6.5 points, if not 10, putting the president in a very difficult position. Now, I think that there's leverage over the U.S. Senate and Cornyn and Senate President Thune, Senate Leader Thune, to get the SAVE Act across. but it doesn't sound like, based on the news today, that that's going to happen. So I almost wonder if we should just say the hell with it and endorse Paxton, because he's a far better Senate candidate and senator waiting to happen.
It is. I must say that in the 50 years I've been in American politics, I have never seen a more selfless act of Ken Paxton, who could very well still win this Senate seat. In fact, I would argue might be well positioned to do so, to say, look, I'll give up my personal ambitions and my candidacy if the Senate will simply end the filibuster and allow J.D. Vance to break the tie to pass the SAVE Act, which the president correctly calls the Save America Act. It's really not that controversial. It simply says that one has to be a qualified U.S. citizen to vote in a federal election, and one needs to have a certain form of ID. These are perfectly reasonable concepts. We have 50 votes, but because of an antiquated rule among gentlemen, we don't have the filibuster. Now, the instant Republicans lose control of the Senate, if they do, they will end the filibuster and they will ram through some of those left-wing extremist legislations you've ever seen. We have a unique opportunity right now to save the country by passing this vote. And John Thune, I bet Donald Trump wishes, if he had to guess again, he had supported Rick Scott to be the majority leader than John Thune, who will not even leave the Senate in session so that Trump may have recess appointments. I mean, there are many jobs in the Trump administration that are yet vacant, or even worse, still filled by Biden quislings that have not been filled because there's no process for confirmation. If the Senate was kept technically in session, Trump would have the ability to make at least temporary appointments so we could actually run the machinery of government. But of course, that they won't allow that. On top of this idea that both senators must agree on the choice of a U.S. attorney who might be in a position to investigate the corruption of, well, those two U.S. senators, the so-called blue slip system, where a U.S. attorney has to have at least the acquiescence of a Democrat senator in his state. All of Biden's appointments were duly approved by Republican senators. He had the right to appoint his U.S. attorneys, as horrible as some of them were. But they have not given Donald Trump the same courtesy. In fact, they continue to refuse to confirm his appointments. And I think that is hurting his administration. And you can't sue because it's not a law. It's an antiquated custom. We got to break the filibuster first, and I think that's next.
You know, I think all roads lead back to the corruption of our elections, because you have the problem with not enough senators willing to get this across, but you have the last 3 federal election cycles where, if you restore these Republican losses that we've already mentioned, my count is that since 2020, if you take those 3 elections, we should have 62 Republican senators in office, not 53.
Well, once Saskatchewan and Alberta secede from Canada, which constitutionally they have the right to do and may be in the process of doing, and then become independent, then applying for statehood, and get you at least 4 more conservative members of the Senate and a bunch of conservative members of the House.
I'm thinking maybe Cuba and Venezuela, too, give us 4 more.
That's an interesting idea. I wonder if the president would also then appoint Marco Rubio, in addition to being the Archivist of the United States, the National Security Advisor, the Secretary of State, but would also appoint him governor of Cuba.
That would be one more thing for him to put in his resume, which he's handled everything really well so far.
No, I'm very, very pleased and happy with my home state senator. His politics were not always mine. I did support him over Charlie Crist in the Tea Party circle, and I'm glad I did. He has been a valiant warrior against Marxism and Marxist narco-trafficking in this hemisphere, where he and Trump are obviously, based on what they did in Doral this weekend with all those Central and South American leaders in this new coalition to fight the narco drug trafficking that's mostly done by these leftist Marxist states in this hemisphere. I think that is laudable. If I were the Cubans, I'd be very, very, very nervous right now. After big wins in Venezuela and Honduras and cutting off Cuba's oil, is Cuba next to fall? We'll be right back with Captain Seth Keshel. I'm going to ask you a bit more about the 2020 elections and how you see 2026 shaping up.
This is the Stone Zone with Roger Stone.
He likes politics and he's a professional at the highest level. Roger Stone. Where's Roger?
This is the Stone Zone with Roger Stone.
Roger Stone, who's a one of the smartest political minds. Roger Stone was persecuted. People forget he's actually a brilliant political analyst.
Now, get him his own. It's the Stone Zone. Here's Roger Stone.
And we're back with Captain Seth Keshel. He has a very lively feed over there at Substack. He is author, election integrity analyst, former U.S. Army intelligence captain, and he is also, I think, a very shrewd reader of political trends. I do have to ask you, in your new book, which is The American War on Election Corruption, The Crusade to Restore Trust in Voting, which I highly recommend to you, you say that elections are not stolen but rigged. What do you mean by that?
You know, it was actually Newt Gingrich's comment about the elections not being stolen but rigged. And I wanted to pick the speaker right before because, you and I, Roger, we've toured a lot of events and we tend to talk in circles. And one of the more difficult audiences, and we deal with them all the time in Arizona, regular rank and file Republicans that may not like the president's style, who don't want to talk about election corruption. And I always knew that Speaker Gingrich felt the same way about elections that I did. And by not stolen but rigged, I mean that the 2024 election made it very obvious to me what the capabilities and capacities of the various states to produce which ballot counts are. And it's all based on what types of laws they have on the books. So, well, Governor DeSantis may say that he's got the gold standard of elections. I wouldn't call it that. I would say maybe states like Iowa have the gold standard of elections. But for a large state, clamping down on how much cheating is possible with the more than 3 million mail-in ballots that Florida has every cycle has really turned that state into a blowout. I mean, nobody's going to win Florida for the Democrats for our lifetime, my lifetime, and I'm 41 years old. So forcing voters to request a mail-in ballot, verify addresses, that really tamps down on how much cheating is possible. So rigging is done by what types of laws? The big three laws are automatic voter registration, universal mail-in voting, and ballot harvesting. You have those, you have a Democrat superpower.
Yeah, it's very interesting, the trend in Florida. Now, for the first time, Republicans have over $1 million voter registration edge over Florida Democrats. This was a state that until not that long ago was a purple state rather than a red state. It's become a solidly red state. A lot of this has to do with Hispanic Americans beyond Cubans, Venezuelans, even Puerto Ricans, who are more traditionally Democratic, gravitating to the new Republican Party of Donald Trump, and therefore I think it is easy to say at this point is whoever wins the Republican nomination to be governor of Florida, most likely Congressman Byron Donalds, who's been endorsed by the president, based on that endorsement alone. But whoever wins the Republican nomination, there are several other candidates. The Democrats have no bench here, and their party has atrophied very badly. I think
Roger, there's a few things in Florida I like to watch. There are three things in Florida I really like to watch. Number one, Miami-Dade County is a pretty interesting opportunity for the Republicans everywhere. I get frustrated watching the party in Pennsylvania. They don't seem to realize that if they could just go into Philadelphia County and be anti-crime, anti-corruption, and do 10% better, they could never lose the state again based on the trend in the rest of the state. So Miami-Dade County offers an urban roadmap for Republicans if they can figure out how to replicate that. Number two, the overall trend of Florida. So Florida was R plus 7.8% by registration, 1.1 million more Republicans than Democrats when Trump won by 13 points. Now it's R plus 11.2, almost 1.5 million advantage. What that means is Florida is on pace to be redder than Texas in the next presidential election, whether that's J.D. Vance or Marco Rubio as the party nominee. And Florida has a 1952 to present trend present in which Pennsylvania and Michigan move in the same direction as Florida. So Florida's current lean suggests very strongly that the next Republican nominee will carry both Pennsylvania and Michigan. And then the third thing I like to watch is Duval County, Jacksonville. It has shifted in the same direction as Georgia in every presidential election since 2004. So I can't get party registration figures in Georgia because they don't register by party, but I can read them in Duval County, and Duval County is almost flipped to a Republican registration advantage.
Yeah, no, some of these demographic trends are very, very interesting. Of course, they also, the negative side, look at New York City and the white flight the flight of Catholics, the flight of working class white voters, changing that Democrat primary to produce a Mem Dami. There's never enough time. I'm going to have Captain Seth Keshel back because I want to get his thoughts on 2026 and 2028. I think we beat up the last election pretty good tonight. Seth, good luck with your book again, The American War on Election Corruption, The Crusade to Restore Trust in Voting, by Captain Seth Keshel. You can go to Amazon, grab your copy right now.
Yeah, thank you very much, Roger, for having me on.